Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone joining this webinar. My name is Rajiv Gupta, and I manage a regional program in ASEAN in UNCDF. Welcome to the webinar on policy and regulatory constraints and enablers to women's financial inclusion in Myanmar. Women in Myanmar face a diverse range of financial inclusion constraints, which result in gender differences in patterns of financial access and usage, with implications for their economic empowerment. And some of these financial inclusion constraints may be in the enabling environment. For example, in the financial and non-financial laws, policies and regulations that can influence both the demand and supply of financial services. For instance, whether women can own property or land in their own name to use as collateral for a loan to establish or expand their own business. Or whether alternative forms of collateral are permitted to overcome the lower levels of assets generally held by women due to the lower levels of economic participation and inheritance norms that they face. To accelerate women's financial inclusion to contribute to the economic empowerment, it is vital to identify these policy and regulatory constraints and then develop approaches to address them. Through support from the Australian government, the United Nations Capital Development Fund's ASEAN program has undertaken an assessment recently to identify the policy and regulatory constraints and enablers for women's financial inclusion in Myanmar and generate recommendations for action. And this complements the work we did with the Australian government and supported, and UNCDF received support to undertake on the supply side that is with the financial institutions. And this involved the development of the Gender Self-Assessment Toolkit to assist Myanmar-based financial service providers to more effectively serve the women's market and improve their institutional policies and practices on gender and women's workforce participation. We also had a webinar on the Gender Self-Assessment Toolkit that was developed, and some of you may have participated in the same. We are confident that today's webinar and regulatory assessment findings, which will soon be published as a discussion paper, will stimulate further discussion and future action towards creating a gender-responsive policy environment to advance women's financial inclusion in the country. I'm joined here today by my colleagues Catherine Miles and Julia Zarati, who developed the assessment methodology, conducted the research and consultation process, and co-authored the forthcoming discussion paper detailing the findings and recommendations. With this in mind, the objective of today's webinar are to provide an overview of the assessment framework methodology that was used, highlight findings on the policy and regulatory constraints and enablers to women's financial inclusion in Myanmar, and present recommendations to overcome the constraints identified to enhance women's financial inclusion towards their economic empowerment. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Catherine for the next presentation. Catherine, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajiv. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar. So before setting out the assessment methodology for this research, I'd like to start by sharing some context on women's economic participation and financial inclusion in Myanmar, as this forms the background of why we've undertaken the regulatory assessment. For some of you, this is perhaps not new information, but those who are perhaps less familiar will hopefully find this useful. So women represent more than half of Myanmar's total population at 51.8%, and they also form over half of the country's working age population at 52.3%. Yet they're much more likely to remain economically inactive than men. Currently, women's labour force participation rate is only about 50%, which falls well short of the male participation rate, which is approximately 85%. Now, just under half of the adult population have formal financial access through banks and other regulated financial institutions. These include MFIs and cooperatives, and this is based on the latest FinScope figures from 2018. There are similar levels of financial inclusion between women and men when we talk about access. For example, 69% of women are financially included, both in terms of both formal and informal access, compared to 70% of men. But there are gender diverse patterns of financial access and usage. So, for instance, women access bank products at a lower level to men and instead use non-bank and informal channels more. If we turn to the next slide, what you can see here, this is our conceptual framework for women's financial inclusion at UNCDF. And if you haven't already muted your microphone, if you could do that, please. Women and men can face barriers in accessing informal financial services due to a broad range of interconnected constraints. Now, while some of these barriers are shared between women and men, women can experience greater vulnerability to these shared constraints based on their gender, and that's due to social norms and gender norms. And so there are some distinct constraints that place greater restrictions on women's financial inclusion. Now, women and girls have diverse financial needs and face barriers in the enabling environment. So that's in one of the circles on your left-hand side. They also face barriers in the supply of and in the demand of financial products and services, as well as within the wider socio-cultural context that this demand, supply and enabling environment, so the enabling environment, policies, laws and regulations, that takes place. So as you can see that in front of you. So together, these diverse constraints limit women and girls' access, usage and control over financial products and services that constrain their opportunities for economic empowerment, which is what we've got in the circle on the right-hand side of the screen. And so this is in a wider context where financial inclusion is increasingly recognised as an enabler of women's economic empowerment and absolutely essential to achieve sustainable development. So this regulatory assessment focused on the enabling environment constraints and enablers, so in that left hand circle and cog, and so it looked at that facing women. But as you can see from the diagram, this will have implications for both the supply and demand for financial services, as well as the socio-economic context and the spheres of influence, as these are not operating in isolation at all. In terms of the gender responsive policy environment, what we mean by that is accounting basically for those social norms that influence policy development and its implementation. And that's because laws and policies can both enable and also constrain financial access, usage and control. And Rajiv had mentioned earlier, so restrictions on women's inheritance, for example, can reduce their access to assets and in turn the availability of collateral to use to secure a loan to establish or grow their business. So if we then move to the next slide on customer-centric approach. The women's financial needs and constraints can vary based on different stages of their life cycle, and this could be from in terms of when they're getting married, if they're caring for a family, and also maybe if their spouse dies, for instance. And they can also vary based on their economic segment, whether a woman is a farmer or if she's an employee in the formal sector, or whether she is working as an entrepreneur and has her own business. So these financial needs and also risks that are faced do differ on this basis. So for example, if we take the economic segmentation women entrepreneurs, and again, this just provide context for the regulatory assessment, you'll see women entrepreneurs, they need access to credit to establish and grow their business, and they have a different profile from male entrepreneurs. So based on FinScope data from 2018, we know that women mainly own micro-enterprises in Myanmar, and their male counterparts are more likely than women to have a small or medium-sized enterprise. What's significant is also that many more men, although still it's a low proportion, have a registered or licensed enterprise compared to women. So there's 11% gender gap there, and only 4% of women have such a licensed enterprise. And so this has implications for them to be able to provide documentation to access a loan. And women also will have a different profile in terms of the business sectors that they operate in, with women working more as traders and men in agricultural enterprises, for example. Now, separately to this regulatory assessment, UNCDF is currently working on the supply side in Myanmar with 3 financial service providers on gender-smart product development, using data such as this to understand the different financial needs and behaviours of these economic segments, such as women entrepreneurs, to address their needs better through the provision of such services. These sorts of diverse economic segmentations of the population is also really relevant for addressing constraints in the policy environment for women and men. And so that just sort of forms a little bit of context for the assessment framework. So if we turn now to the next slide, in terms of the framework we used for this process, which was desk-based research complemented by bilateral interviews and a consultative workshop, and it assessed policies related to 4 key areas. And these are areas where we see opportunities to take action and overcome the gaps and constraints in the level of gender responsiveness of the existing policy environment. And these 4 areas, which you can see on the screen, include policy coherence and commitments around the country's national and regional commitments to gender equality, women's economic empowerment and financial inclusion. Secondly, around gender responsive financial regulation. So we're looking at that in terms of both national financial inclusion strategies and other financial laws, policies and regulation. And then thirdly, around women's access to identification documents, access to institutions and assets. And finally, the 4th area that we looked at was around enacting laws protecting women from violence as customers and employees of financial service providers. So these areas were selected as they really provide the context for different areas of the enabling environment, and they were informed by international evidence. So if we just take a deeper look at each area in turn and just understand the kind of questions we were asked. So this first relates to the country's international, constitutional and national policy commitments to gender equality, women's economic empowerment and women's financial inclusion. And that's beyond the financial sector, so out of scope of the national financial regulations. And here we look for evidence around questions of to what extent are international and regional commitments on women's financial inclusion and economic empowerment translated at a national level in Myanmar, in its constitution, in its policies and in its laws. And we also looked at, has the government ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, and have they committed to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which set out this international agenda for women's empowerment. We then turn to the second area of focus for the methodology. This is where we looked at focusing on policy constraints and enablers for women's financial inclusion related to, firstly, the National Financial Inclusion Strategy or the roadmap in Myanmar as it's referred to, and secondly, other relevant financial sector policies, many of which are actually addressed also within that roadmap. For instance, we looked at, in terms of background, it's internationally accepted that these national financial inclusion strategies need to recognise the differences between women and men's access and usage of financial services, and also gender differences in financial inclusion constraints and enablers. And in fact, working in collaboration with UNCDF regional ASEAN work, we worked with the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, AFI. I know maybe someone from AFI was intending to join the call today. And we worked with their Financial Inclusion Strategy Peer Learning Group to develop guidance on this theme, on gender and integrating women's financial inclusion considerations into national financial inclusion strategies. And so drawing on this guidance, our assessment methodology considered to what extent are these international good practices being implemented in scope of Myanmar's strategy, and also related to other policy areas. So just to pull out a couple of them, although you can see more on this screen, we looked at the extent to which sex disaggregated objectives are being set nationally. We looked at the extent to which agent banking and digital financial services are being implemented in the context of this being a key enabler to women's financial inclusion, and particularly in context with lower levels of access to other financial access points. We also looked at the extent to which tiered customer due diligence requirements are being implemented For example, this is because at an international level, it's recognised that a lack of identification to meet international know your customer requirements for or customer due diligence requirements for anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism can be a barrier to women's financial inclusion, because they can often have less ID to prove their identity or verify that. Conversely, again, it's internationally recognised that tiered customer due diligence requirements are recognised to overcome this constraint as an enabler. And in fact, UNCDF has worked with AFI again on global guidance on this policy area. So I can refer you to that on the screen. So do take a look if you haven't seen it already. And then the other area that we looked at, just to give you an example in terms of gender responsive financial policies and regulations, was the extent to which gender diversity of financial institutions is considered to advance market reach of women. And this is because at an international level, gender diversity within financial service providers is recognised to enable them to better reach women and design products and services that target diverse women market segments. And furthermore, it's again internationally recognised that there's greater inclusion of women in the financial sector regulator can contribute to increased stability of the banking system, foster economic growth and support more effectively monetary and fiscal policy making. Indeed, I can refer you to work done by the IMF on that. So if we then turn to the third area of the assessment framework, now this section analysed the policy constraints and enablers in Myanmar related to citizenship and identity documents in terms of registering a business. As we saw, the very few women have a formally registered business in Myanmar, so that's maybe there are some constraints that they face there because of that gender gap. And it also considered inheritance as well. And we drew on data from the World Bank's country profile of Myanmar from Women, Business and the Law, which is an amazing resource, and you really should look at it if you haven't already. And that highlights gender discriminatory laws that can restrict women's economic opportunities and participation. And some of these are particularly relevant for women's financial inclusion, as they can affect the patterns of demand for financial services. So finally, in terms of our assessment methodology, just to share that we looked at laws protecting women from violence. And here we looked at gender-based violence and sexual harassment because this can impact women's labour force participation in general, but very specifically for financial inclusion in financial service providers and regulatory institutions. Then it can constrain their mobility to financial access point with implications for their formal financial inclusion. So here we considered legislation on gender-based violence and sexual harassment in employment and in public places. And whilst it doesn't automatically seem relevant, we also looked at laws related to child marriage, because this can indirectly impact women and girls' financial inclusion. Indeed, it's estimated that child marriage reduces earnings in adulthood for women by approximately 9%. And conversely, there's some emerging evidence on the impact of financial literacy training and microcredit being provided to adolescent girls as a contributing factor to prevent their child marriage. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Julia, who, based on this framework, is going to be presenting what the results were for answering these questions in the Myanmar context. So if someone can mute me, and Julia, you're unmuted, and please proceed on the key findings.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So the enablers for the country to advance women's financial inclusion include the government of Myanmar's support for the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the Beijing Plus 25 process, and commitments to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. For instance, as part of its commitment to the SDGs, the government developed the Myanmar Sustainable Development Plan, and this plan recognizes financial inclusion as an important goal to enable broader development outcomes. But these commitments are not always consistently translated in the country's regional commitments or nationally in different policy areas. To respond, UNCDF, throughout its regional and country programming, is providing technical support to advance multiple aspects of women's financial access, usage and control in the country. Through Myanmar's regional cooperation, while financial inclusion is a national priority within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, the objective of its Working Committee on Financial Inclusion are non-sex disaggregated, nor is there any explicit focus on women's financial inclusion and gender differential constraints and enablers. And this is in spite of the objective of the ASEAN Committee of Women to increase women entrepreneurs' access to credit. And the lack of policy coherence is also present nationally. To date, the government of Myanmar has not adopted a comprehensive legal definition of discrimination against women, which is in line with CEDAW, despite its ratification of the convention. So we have a number of recommendations. There is scope for greater policy coherence on women's financial inclusion within ASEAN and an opportunity for Myanmar to advocate for this policy coherence at a regional level. UNCDF provides technical support to Asian financial sector policymakers through the Working Committee on Financial Inclusion to provide it with policy support and data analysis. Consequently, through this aspect of its programming, it is well positioned to actively respond to promote ASEAN policy coherence and action on women's financial inclusion. If we move to constitutional commitment, UNCDF, in scope of its Gender Equality Fund work, is providing technical support to the Women's Participation Technical Working Group to support the implementation of priorities within the Myanmar National Strategic Plan for the Advancement of Women. As a result, based on technical assistance received from UNCDF, subsequent policy briefs have acknowledged various constraints to women's access and usage of financial services. This has included gender norms related barriers, such as women's lower level of collateral to access credit due to customer inheritance practices, as well as discrimination in the land and in property registration process. And among other policies, we considered the Myanmar National Comprehensive Development Plan, the Private Sector Development Framework and Action Plan, and the Small and Medium Enterprise Development Law and Policies. In this case, the main constraints include the lack of acknowledgement of the greater vulnerabilities of women entrepreneurs to constraints such as access to credit compared with male-owned enterprises. Also, the SME policies does not define micro-enterprises or women-owned business and does not address financial inclusion of women-owned SMEs. Talking about the MSPO, the Myanmar National Strategic Plan for the Advancement of Women 2013-2022 prioritizes women in the economy, but does not acknowledge the constraints in women's access to credit or other forms of financial services, nor does it coordinate with the Ministry of Finance to address this. So we have a selection of recommendations, which includes to create an overall implementation plan with an accompanying budget and a clear monitoring and evaluation framework. Create a mechanism to promote the coordination between all implementing bodies of the NSPO to achieve greater policy coherence and joint implementation of the plan. Then focus on a broader range of financial products for women and not only access to credit. And finally, acknowledge and address constraints including land and property ownership that limit women's financial access and usage. If we move to the National Financial Inclusion Roadmap, the existence of a National Financial Inclusion Strategy or Roadmap is a solid basis for progress towards women's formal financial inclusion. And so its existence is a good start. But there is opportunity to enhance the gender responsiveness of the Myanmar Financial Inclusion Roadmap. It is internationally accepted that national financial inclusion strategies need to recognize the difference between men and women's access and usage of financial services, and gender differences in financial inclusion constraints and enablers. Yet, the Myanmar Financial Inclusion Roadmap does not include any policies to address gender differences in financial inclusion. It also does not focus on usage or sex disaggregated quantitative objectives and targets for women and men, recognizing their levels of access to and usage of financial services. Doing so in future iterations of the roadmap would conform to global good practice. Other policies areas we consider in the assessment were the microfinance law, the collateral law, the collateral registries and credit bureau, sex disaggregated data, consumer client protection regulation, and financial competence building. In these cases, enablers include that collateral registries and approval of the credit bureau are in development, and there is a well-established regulated microfinance sector. We also consider a number of other financial policies, for example, the agent banking, the digital financial services regulation, the anti-money laundering and countering financing of terrorism, and the gender diversity within the financial sector. For example, in this case, enablers include that Myanmar is a member of the Financial Action Task Force and has implemented tiered customer due diligence requirements through taking a risk-based approach to customer due diligence. Also, enablers are that Myanmar has implemented agent banking and has a digital financial services regulation. In this case, we have a number of regulations as well, and it is recommended that the updated National Financial Inclusion Roadmap establish sex disaggregated objectives and targets for financial inclusion and incentivize the collection of sex disaggregated supply-side data from all types of financial service providers. To support this, we recommend that the regulatory reporting templates are updated to allow financial service providers to input sex disaggregated data. UNCDF has already responded by supporting financial service providers with the collection and analysis of sex disaggregated supply-side data as part of the Institutional Gender-Based Self-Assessment Toolkit, GSAT. To complement these, UNCDF has been support the government and Central Bank of Myanmar through training on the collection and usage of sex disaggregated data from the regulator's perspective. Furthermore, there is scope to implement policy initiatives to boost women's participation in financial service providers and financial regulatory institutions, as well as gather national level data on women's workforce participation in the sector. Again, UNCDF has sought to address these through working with local partners to improve their institutional policies and practices on gender and women's workforce participation, including gathering institutional level sex disaggregated data on the topic. There is also the opportunity to allow alternatives for more collateral from women to circumnavigate the barriers women face in accessing assets that can be used as collateral. And there is also scope to promote the development of alternative credit scoring models to address the barriers faced by women in building a traditional credit history. If we move to identification documents, institution and assets, we note that addressing indirect and demand-side constraint in the enabling environment is also critical to achieving women's financial inclusion. And this is why social norms can mediate financial access and usage in Myanmar. While there are high levels of possession of national identification documents among women overall, some constraints exist in terms of women accessing passport and obtaining identification documents, particularly in conflict-affected areas. At the same time, a married woman cannot apply for passport in the same way as a married man. which may have implications for women's ability to obtain a passport. Moreover, women are less likely to hold driving license due to social norms. And in terms of recommendation, there is an opportunity to advocate a change in the law so that women can apply for passports in the same way as men, which is a key issue highlighted by the World Bank Women, Business and the Law project. And this will provide them with multiple forms of identification to meet customer due diligence requirements to open a financial account. With respect to women access to assets, the National Land Use Policy guarantees women and men with equal inheritance right over land, but customary practices in Myanmar prevail in terms of inheritance of property and land, and discrimination exists in the land and property registration process. These can limit women's access to productive assets such as land. And in order to support women's access to credit, there is an opportunity for policymakers to conduct campaigns to raise awareness of equal rights to inheritance. This may target people living in ethnic and rural regions where customary law can be commonly applied. In terms of access to institutions, while women can legally register a business in the same way as men, existing policy fails to acknowledge that women face greater hurdles. As a result, there is an opportunity to conduct a gender analysis on the constraints faced by entrepreneurs in registering their business. If we move to the laws protecting women from violence, the gender-based violence, GBV, and sexual harassment is a problem in Myanmar and can impact women's labor force participation in financial service providers and regulatory institutions. It can also constrain their mobility to financial access points with implications for financial inclusion. Although Myanmar ratified CEDAW in 1997 and is a signatory of international treaties that condemned gender-based violence, there is no specific law that requires the prohibition of sexual harassment and violence, including domestic violence against women. To address this legal gap, the Prevention and Protection of Violence Against Women Bill, called PIVAO Law in Myanmar, has been in development since 2013, but it needs to be adopted and aligned with CEDAW and other international standards. Furthermore, there is scope for advocacy groups to highlight gender-based violence as a constraint to women's financial inclusion, and for the Central Bank of Myanmar and the Ministry of Finance to acknowledge the link in their financial inclusion policies and strategies going forward. With respect to child marriage, is a key enabler to women's financial inclusion that the Myanmar child law sets 18 as the minimum age of marriage. However, there are some pockets of the population whereby this law may not be enforced due to customary practices, and this needs to be acknowledged and addressed. After analyzing these 4 areas within the assessment framework and highlighting recommendations related to the specific policies that we reviewed, I will now hand back to Catherine for some of the cross-cutting conclusions.
Thank you very much, Julia. So just in terms of the cross-cutting recommendations and conclusions, now today I should start by saying we've only had a limited time with you to share some of the selection of the constraints and opportunities for action. So we haven't gone through everything. This is just some of the highlights where we found opportunities for action within this gender policy and regulatory assessment for Myanmar. But what I'd like to say is that while some of the recommendations relate to very specific policy areas, so either an updating or the implementation phase of a single policy, where there are some cross-cutting areas that we noticed was that there are gaps that relate to many of these policies to do with, for example, the need for financial resources to support the implementation. So you've got your policies there in practice, but unless you have those resources to support their implementation, then they might not actually be implemented. Likewise, capacity building, the need to support that. This general theme around sex disaggregated data being vitally important for all of the policy areas that we're looking at, particularly when we're looking at gender differences. And then this idea around enhanced coordination and policy coherence between different parts of the government and their respective policies, and also coherence and coordination with external stakeholders as well, to sort of hold these policies to account and ensure that they're implemented in practice. So policy processes take time, and change doesn't happen overnight, and this can be a real challenge with addressing policy constraints. But we believe at UNCDF that with sufficient resources and technical support and capacity building, and in particularly with this better sex disaggregated data, which we're starting to see, and also this facilitation of enhanced coordination between government bodies and stakeholders, we can achieve this policy coherence, and the opportunities that we've set out here today related to policy constraints to women's financial inclusion, these can be leveraged, and the gaps identified can be closed. And so going forward, UNCDF and with support from the Australian government and its other supporters and partners will together be seeking to address these gaps, and going forward we aim to create with that a more gender responsive policy environment. So something that is not just is sensitive to these gender differences, but is actually actively responding to areas where there are social norms that are creating these challenges, so that we achieve that transformational change which we're looking to with advancing women's financial inclusion and their economic empowerment. And by doing so, we really hope that taking advantage of these opportunities will advance women's financial inclusion and contribute to the broader objective of sustainable economic growth in Myanmar. Now, given that we're all sitting probably locked down in our respective family homes around the world at the moment, we thought it was relevant before we close and open for questions to just highlight this issue of COVID-19 and just sort of put on the table the fact that there may be some financial inclusion policy implications for facing women as a result of that. So we want to acknowledge, first of all, that we are operating, all of us, in very challenging circumstances globally. I'm sitting here in the UK. I know that Julia has been dialing in from Boston in the US, and many of you dialing in from Myanmar, and others in Bangkok and other locations around the world. We don't know what the future is going to hold, but there is already a significant discussion online regarding the gender dimensions of this crisis. And that's both in terms of deaths. We know that early data is suggesting that men are more likely to die actually than women. But in terms of the longer term impacts, there's also some discussion on the implications there. And what we want to pause to reflect on is how this situation may influence women's financial inclusion with implications for policy responses, not just the financial sector policy responses, but also wider economic policy responses when we basically are addressing the aftermath of this crisis economically. What we know at the moment is that domestic and international migration flows have been impacted, and that has implications for remittance providers, senders and receivers. And we also know through research that UNCDF has conducted, and Robin, who's on the line today, was pivotal in that, is that there are gendered patterns of remittance flows within Myanmar and within the wider region. And so, questions are there. How is that going to be impacted? We know it's being impacted. What is the result going to be of that? We also recognise that there will be an economic impact on women and men, but these are anticipated to be different, particularly for women as they take on greater responsibility for childcare during this lockdown and when schools are closed in some parts of the world. And they also have to give up their informal employment to undertake this unpaid care when children are out of school. So, that raises questions. What does that mean then for women's financial inclusion, because their economic participation is going to be so significantly impacted as a result of this crisis? So we'd like to open the floor in a moment to questions about the assessment that we've undertaken, but also open up the floor to ask you to think about and maybe contribute some thoughts around the COVID-19 crisis and how you think that this is maybe going to differentially impact women and men's level of financial inclusion formally, and maybe gender differential financial needs and risks facing women and men in Myanmar and within the wider region. So thank you very much for your attention. We're going to close the screen so we can take the questions.
I can, first of all, I can address one of the question, which is the question from Nandini. Nandini is asking to better understand how women have to apply differently for an ID and passports. So basically, there are some differences in the application process itself. Specifically for the ID card, women can apply in the same way as men, but although legally there are no differences facing women and men in terms of the process and the requirements to obtain the national registration card or the citizen scrutiny card, the big difference is between married women and married men. And this has implication for women's ability to obtain a passport. Indeed, we did a survey in 2017, and we found that only 9% of the surveyed women held a passport. And then specifically on the citizenship, there are both our study and a number of other studies that confirm that women face a number of barriers in both acquiring, confirming, and also retaining the citizenship, as well as conferring the citizenship to their children. And this is due mainly to both social and religious norms, and those norms influence access to information, which are crucial to obtaining citizenship documentation, but also the mobility of women who travel to obtain information and file application, the preference for men over women in the household to obtain the citizen's documentation, and the implementation of laws that prohibit polygamy, for example. And moreover, we can say that the process for obtaining the citizenship is very complicated, time-consuming, and requires travel. And is it also costly? It has both high official and non-official expenses associated to it, which, given the lower levels of income and assets, women are definitely less likely to be able to afford to travel to obtain the citizenship. So I hope this responds to the question.
And maybe Julia, just on that point, one thing that to highlight, actually, we ran, and this was prior to this particular piece of work, but we ran some focus groups in Myanmar for a separate piece of work, which was to identify constraints and enablers generally to women's financial inclusion. And we heard, and I mean, it's only really anecdotal evidence, that there was, because of this cost to go and get some of forms of identification, there were gender preferences that were being played out into how money was being spent and prioritized. So it would be the young man who was sent to go and get his ID as opposed to the young woman because he was more likely to need it for work. And that was just anecdotal, and it would change from area to area.
And there are some more questions in the chat, and if you want, Catherine, I can read the questions and then we can address the question.
Please, yeah,
for example, If you want to address a question from Lisa, Lisa is asking, is mentioning that there is one thing, creating policies, regulations that support women's access to financial, but how does one change cultural and social norms?
Well, I think this is a question that a lot of us still don't know necessarily the answer for. There's work that is being done by some amazing organisations out there, not just in Myanmar but internationally, trying to answer that question. So it will be, it will depend on the norm. It will depend on the cultural context. And so this is where it's really helpful to understand what that norm is first of all, and what impact it is having when it comes to financial inclusion and behaviours of women and men, and so identifying attitudes as well, and that's where participatory approaches can be really helpful in understanding what these norms are. And then in terms of achieving change, this is where awareness campaigns can be useful, working with experts who and NGOs, for example, through partnerships to achieve behaviour change. A lot of it's around awareness raising and communicating what the rights are in practice, because often it's just a lack of awareness and knowledge, but also engaging men and boys. It's internationally recognised is a useful way to achieve change. So, what is the benefit for them of their wife being economically active in the formal sector, of formally registering her business so she can formally access that credit? And there's great examples of work that have been done, for instance, in neighbouring within the wider region. So in India, for instance, there is an example of a bank that when they onboard new female colleagues, they also invite their husbands to come along during that onboarding process to explain to them that actually that their wife is not going to have as much time to undertake these unpaid care responsibilities because she is formally working and is bringing in a salary from that work, and that will require them to maybe pull their weight a little bit around the house. And so there are different approaches that different institutions have changed to child to try and achieve some of these social norms changes. But engaging with men and boys is a key strategy through multi-stakeholder and NGO partnerships. I'll pass back to you, Julia, in case you've got anything else to add on that.
No, I'm fine on that, and we have a number of other questions. For example, Alberto from ESCAP is asking about sex disaggregated data, our work on sex disaggregated data and how to improve sex disaggregated data. I wonder whether if Robin is in line, if he wants to respond on the question, either Robin or Rajiv. Otherwise, we can address the question, me and Catherine.
Please do, Robin, and if you can,
yeah, Robin here. So basically, we work in two streams. I mean, one of the things is every given form, pretty much that you fill out in the world, will have three things on it, right? Your location, your gender, and often your date of birth. So often, sex disaggregated data is already out there, but it's not being utilized for product development, for market research, or market expansion, or policy making. So one of the things that we do is we actually we train regulators, for example, in market and national survey data and the sex disaggregated data there. Some of these stats that you saw earlier on breaking down the world of women entrepreneurship, for example, where those barriers are very obvious. And the other is doing the same with, for example, with microfinance institutions at the supply side. So we've done trainings on gender smart product development with 3 MFIs in the first quarter of this year. And also that can then use the market data, these national surveys, but also their management information system data. So all the information that they've got all these times, every time they fill out a loan form, for example. And that can be very helpful to and making those basic disaggregations by, for example, young man with young women, old man with old women, but also in different areas in the country. Can be very relevant to make it a bit more pragmatic. One of them, business registration, for example. We just saw that very few women have a formal business registration. So if you make that a loan requirement, or any financial inclusion requirement for that matter, you're cutting out literally 95% of the market. And that gets worsened, in fact, in the more rural areas, in for example, provinces like Kachin, Kayan, Shan, Mon State in Myanmar compared to the more Yangon and Lille. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. May I jump in a minute, please? Thank you very much, Robin. I think we discussed this before sometime in Bangkok. I just wanted to mention we have a similar project, a similar topic in Cambodia, and we should, chat bilateral at some point. Thank you very much.
Great.
Yeah,
thanks,
absolutely.
Alberto.
That's good. Yeah.
Perfect. So we have another point from Matt. Matt wrote that they support 300 female-owned micro-enterprises in Myanmar, and they did last week a survey, so very timely, and they found that 58% identified demand side as a key challenge. Cash is tight for customer. And before long, this will be exacerbated for businesses by inventory shortages and increasing prices. And Matt is asking, what role does the Myanmar government play to relieve the resulting cash crunch, which especially hits traders, more likely to be women? And I wonder whether, Katrin, you have any points on that.
So, I think every government in the world will be having to develop approaches, economic approaches and policies urgently to address the huge shock that the global economy is currently experiencing. There is obviously a question the extent to which these strategies that are developed and which will be implemented undoubtedly at great speed will sufficiently take into account both a sector and a gender perspective. So that there will be a role that the Myanmar government will undoubtedly take to address this, and it will be vitally important that all of you who are on the line today advocate to take such an approach in these policy responses economically and highlight that there are these gender differences in both the economic impact and therefore connected to that the financial impact in terms of access and usage of financial services facing women and men. It's not to say that it will be necessarily more severe for one or the other, but as Robin has just highlighted as well, taking that approach where you look at the heterogeneity of both women and men and their different financial risks and needs, and therefore, as connected to that, the economic impacts, how that will affect them differently, is really going to be crucial in designing and implementing these policy responses. So please do, advocate that any responses to this current cash crisis do account for these different sector profiles and gender profiles of those impacted. Julia, back to you.
Yes, so we are having a lot of questions. I hope we can address all of them in the next 5 minutes. We'll try our best. So Francis has a question on how interested is the government in Myanmar to introduce more gender-focused policies. It seems that the government is extremely interested, especially in the last few days, because the National Plan for the Advancement of Women that we mentioned was developed in 2013. However, its implementation started in 2017, and now there are well-established mechanisms to implement the plan. So it seems that now the government is interested in introducing more gender-sensitive policies, and there is more attention overall to women's empowerment. And we have another question from Sakshi. There is a delicate balance between tackling gender gap using data and at the same time incorporating customer privacy and data protection principles. Any lessons experienced around this? Either Catherine or Robin, if you have any points on this topic.
Yeah, so I'm sure Robin will have something to add and probably more depth in a moment. But one thing just to say, this particularly becomes an issue when you do talk about sex disaggregated data. And just what I want to highlight is not Myanmar specific, but so internationally, different countries around the world have diverse rules as to whether a financial institution can sex disaggregate data and analyze data because of that customer privacy aspect. However, there are workarounds around that maintain that privacy, but allows you still to obtain that data. So there, in some countries where there are national ID cards, which that data is taken, but that indicates whether individuals are male or female based on a coding within that the ID card. You can figure out whether or not it's a male or female client, even if you're not actually allowed to ask that that information directly from the customer because of customer privacy. It's not that you're breaking customer privacy, but you can basically find workarounds to help you with that analytics internally as a financial institution. And secondly, other approaches that have been used include looking at names that people have, whether obviously it's not a perfect science, but you can, with many names, determine whether it's a male or female name, and that has been used in some countries to support analysis of that data, whilst not impacting customer privacy at all, but allowing you to have an understanding of what your customer profile is and therefore their diverse behaviours to better design products. And I can refer you to the Financial Alliance for Women and some of the work that they've published on this theme. The organisation used to be referred to as the Global Banking Alliance for Women, but they've got some examples of that in their resources online. Robin, have you got anything else to add?
Well, I think you said most. Of course, it's always the utmost importance to take data privacy extremely serious. The other point is that there's of course a layer of information, right? I mean, not talking here about credit card numbers or bank account numbers that we would be analyzing, but basic customer segmentation. And that leads to another point, which is, of course, there's also a risk of not having gender smart products out there or gender blind products, right? So yeah, it's a delicate balance, and up to the degree that you use the information for more informed decision making and better customer-centric product, then it's of course a good balance to strike. So there's also the other side of the coin where, how can a private sector company offer better products and services that do not harm customers through data insights. It's the data insights, of course, themselves will hopefully lead to better informed decisions.
Thank you, Robin. And so, Julia, I think we've probably got time for one last question, maybe. If we maybe could bundle up the questions, if we've got multiple left to answer.
I guess, yeah, there are a lot actually, but Niraj was asking about the privilege, if any, for women to legally own any fixed property like land, for an example. I can start responding and then catching if you have any additional points. So basically, the advantage for women is that this kind of fixed property or productive assets can be used as collateral. For example, in Myanmar, a lot of agricultural loan are issued by the Agricultural Development Bank, and land is the preferred collateral. And if women do not own land, they can access to agricultural loan. So this is one of the main point of having fixed property to be used as collateral. And the process to register land is complicated, and there is a lack of awareness that women can register land in their name. So normally a high percentage of land ownership in Myanmar is registered in the name of the husband.
And maybe just to add to that, and this is also for property registration, you know, even if legally women and men have the same process and the same rights to own land and property, there can be some norms, social norms, that mean that there is discrimination in that process, and that can also come from the woman herself or her family in that process. So during some consultations, participatory focus groups that we've done in Myanmar, we found even, you know, very well-educated women saying that they'd inherited some property, or that they'd bought property themselves, but when they actually went with their money and their earnings, but when they went to actually do the formal registration process, they just put it in their husband's name. They didn't question that it shouldn't be in his name, even though it was given to them and not to them and their husband, and or it was being completely paid for by them and their salary. And so that's where social norms come in, and that's where education and behaviour change can be so important, because inadvertently those women who shared this information with us were basically getting them, reducing the opportunities for them to be able to access loans in the future through using that land and property as collateral. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you. And we are running over time, but just some people are asking about the recording and the slides. And yes, I think we can share the recording and the slides. Am I right?
Absolutely. So this will all become available on our website, on the UNCDF's website. So give us a few days before that is done, and I'm sure we'll be able to share an email to inform you around that. So thank you very, very much for being a part of today's conversation. This isn't the end of the conversation, as we say that the publication is going to be launched as a discussion paper, and correct us if we're wrong in any of our analysis as well, you know, or if there's anything that we've missed, and things do change. So be in touch. We will encourage you to review that paper and provide us with feedback in due course, and certainly share the insights that you've heard today, and hopefully that will inform your future work. So thank you from my side, and on behalf of the whole team at UNCDF. Julia, I'll pass back to you to also say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much to all of you.